On November 12, 1948, the judges of the Tokyo Tribunal condemned 7 of Japan's wartime leaders to hang for their part in the Second World War. Every one of them had served Emperor Hirohito, the man in whose name Japan had waged the war. Yet Hirohito was never indicted, never summoned, and never questioned. Although the leaders of his own government would hang that December, the emperor would remain on his throne until his death in 1989. He had been kept out of the trial deliberately, and not because the case against him was weak. The Allies had not initially agreed to spare the emperor. The Potsdam Declaration, the Allied ultimatum that had demanded Japan's surrender, had promised that stern justice shall be meted out to all war criminals. And after Japan announced its surrender on August 15, 1945, several of them wanted Hirohito tried. Australia pushed hardest, pressing the other allies to name the emperor as a major war criminal. But on September 6, 1945, President Truman approved the initial post-surrender policy, which directed General Douglas MacArthur, the supreme commander for the Allied powers, to govern Japan, not by dismantling his government, but through it instead, using Japan's ministries and bureaucracy while keeping the emperor as his head of state. But despite this directive, the demand for a trial continued to grow. On September 18, 1945, a resolution was introduced in the United States Congress demanding that Hirohito stand trial, and later that same year in December, Australia filed formal charges against the emperor on 2 counts. Firstly, for waging a war of aggression, and secondly, for bearing responsibility for the atrocities Japanese forces had committed. So as one arm of the American government pushed for Hirohito to appear in the dock, another, led by the president and the general running Japan, had already decided to rule through him instead. Inside General MacArthur's own command, the effort to keep Hirohito from trial was already underway. On October 1, 1945, Major John Anderton, an officer at GHQ, the Tokyo headquarters from which MacArthur governed occupied Japan, handed MacArthur a legal brief. But it was not an inquiry into whether Hirohito could be tried, it was a defense. Anderton urged that facts be gathered to show the emperor had acted under fraud, menace, or duress, and to keep the occupation peaceful and hold Japan back from a revolution and communism, that positive action be taken to prevent his indictment altogether. But this wasn't just Anderton's view. The brief reached MacArthur through his military secretary, General Bonner Fellers, and on October 2nd, Fellers penned a memorandum to MacArthur arguing that Hirohito should escape any post-war reckoning. So the case to spare Hirohito was made before a single Allied prosecutor had even been appointed to try Japan's leadership for war crimes. That case soon became MacArthur's own. On January 25, 1946, he sent a cable to Washington stating that investigators had found no specific evidence tying Hirohito to the decisions that took Japan to war, and warned that indicting the emperor would collapse Japan's government and require 1 million troops to hold the country. There was a reason no such evidence had surfaced. Fellers had spent months interviewing around 40 of Japan's senior political and military leaders, including many of the men the Allies were preparing to charge, about the surrender and the origins of Japan's war. All the interviews were separate, yet they told the same story. Each account shifted responsibility for the war away from the emperor and onto the military instead. Hirohito had wanted peace, they said, but his generals had forced it upon him. That same claim was also about to be written into Japan's law. The American occupation sought to replace the old Meiji Constitution, under which the emperor held sovereign power, with a democratic one instead. But when Japan's own government drafted a version that left Hirohito's authority intact, MacArthur's government section, run by General Courtney Whitney, and his deputy, the lawyer Charles Cadiz, wrote its own in February 1946. It stripped Hirohito of every governing power that he once held and reduced his role to a symbol of the state. The image of the powerless monarch that Feller's interviewees had described was now being turned into a legal fact by the American occupation force. But the prosecution was closing in on the men around Hirohito. Since December 1945, the American chief prosecutor, Joseph Keenan, had been building cases against them, and by spring 1946, he had chosen 28 defendants to stand trial. Among them were Koichi Kido, the Lord Keeper of the Privy Seal, who, as Hirohito's closest advisor, had near daily contact with Hirohito throughout the war, and Hideki Tojo, who had served as his prime minister. Each of them knew the emperor's involvement, and each was now being questioned. Therefore, as the interrogations drew closer to Hirohito, his aides acted first in order to fix his account before any other testimony could expose him. On March 18, 1946, Hirohito summoned 5 aides and dictated his version of the war to them. He had reigned as a constitutional monarch, he told them, overruled by the generals who forced the fighting. It was meant to sound candid, yet the questions he answered had been shaped in part by General Fellers, the American officer that was already building the case to spare him. Weeks later, a summary of that account reached Fellers at GHQ, and the emperor's defense was complete before any witnesses had been called to trial. The International Military Tribunal for the Far East, known as the Tokyo Trial, opened on May 3, 1946. More than a year after proceedings commenced, it called Koichi Kido, the emperor's closest advisor to the stand, to give testimony. Before Kido spoke, the chief prosecutor, Joseph Keenan, had already told the press there was no evidence tying Hirohito to the charge of Japan's leaders planning and waging a war of aggression. So Kido provided an account that also cleared Hirohito. He said he was an emperor who had wanted peace, and he had been overruled by his own ministers. But the more Kido was questioned about his advice to Hirohito, about the tripartite pact, about Tojo's appointment, the more Hirohito's responsibility came into question. The witness who had come to clear Hirohito kept accidentally implicating him instead, and so the president of the tribunal, the Australian judge Sir William Webb, had to remind the court again and again that it was not trying the emperor. The next to take the stand was Hideki Tojo, the general who had been prime minister when Japan attacked Pearl Harbor, and who ran the war until he was forced from office in 1944. His testimony had been arranged well in advance. In March 1946, General Fellers had approached Admiral Mitsumasa Yonai, Japan's former prime minister from before the war, and asked that Tojo take responsibility himself. He was asked to tell the court that he had chosen war under his own authority, even against the emperor's wishes, so that Hirohito could be cleared. Yonai agreed, and Tojo, a loyal subject to the last, agreed to bear responsibility and shield the emperor. So on December 27, 1947, Tojo testified that the emperor bore no blame for the war and that it had been fought in self-defense. But 4 days later, Tojo contradicted his own testimony. And this time, the implication of Hirohito was far worse. When asked whether Kido had ever acted against the emperor's wish for peace, he said that no Japanese subject, and least of all a senior official, would go against the emperor's will. Yet he had spent the previous days telling the court the ministers had taken Japan to war without the emperor. But the two statements contradicted each other. If no minister would ever act against the emperor's will, then the war had happened with the emperor's consent, and Tojo had just implied as much in open court. Webb saw the problem immediately. What happened next was not a trial deciding the emperor's guilt, but a group of men working to contain what Tojo had just implied. Subscribe and keep watching to find out what happened, because that is the part almost no one knows. Over the next 6 days, intermediaries of Hirohito contacted Kido, who then reached Tojo as he was being held in Sugamo prison. Word was sent that he had to correct his previous statement. So on January 6, 1948, Chief Prosecutor Keenan gave Tojo the chance to do exactly that. Tojo told the court that the emperor had approved the war only as the Constitution required, on his minister's advice, and he had not chosen war himself. Both representatives of the emperor and the chief prosecutor had now worked to clear the emperor of any responsibility, and because the court never called Hirohito to give evidence, what Tojo had implied was never tested against him. But the trial's image of Hirohito was a lie. As early as 1937, he had personally authorized the Japanese Army's use of poison gas in China, a weapon which was banned by treaty and which killed soldiers and civilians alike. So, Hirohito was no stranger to sanctioning such attacks when, on November 3, 1941, his chiefs of staff briefed him on the upcoming attack on Pearl Harbor and the strikes planned alongside it against the Philippines and Malaya. And when Hirohito asked when it would come, they told him, December 7th, 1941 in Hawaii. A month later, Hirohito himself then sanctioned the final decision for war at an imperial conference in his own palace. Each fact was harder to explain away than the last, but there was a further act which truly undid the facade of his passiveness. In August 1945, after America atom-bombed Hiroshima, the Soviet Union declared war on Japan and swept into Japanese-held Manchuria, and a second atomic bomb fell on Nagasaki. Japan's leaders froze over how to react. There was deadlock over whether Japan should surrender or continue trying to fight. But Hirohito broke the deadlock, overruling his divided government and forcing it to accept the Allied terms for peace. It did not prove he could dictate policy at will, but it proved he held real power and could use it when it counted. The true question was how that same power had worked when Japan first chose war, and the trial never put him under oath to answer it. The image of a powerless emperor prevailed in court instead. That image held all the way through to the verdicts in the Tokyo trial. In November 1948, the judgments delivered found every one of the 25 defendants guilty. 7 of them, including Hideki Tojo, were sentenced to hang. 16 more, Koichi Kido among them, were sentenced to life imprisonment, and the final 2 received long prison terms. So the account written and pushed by MacArthur and his staff before the trial had lasted to the end, and the responsibility for the entire war was instead placed upon the men who had served Hirohito rather than he himself, although sparing him came with a cost. That cost was plain to the men who had delivered the verdict. The tribunal had 11 judges in total, each coming from one of the Allied nations that had defeated Japan. When they wrote their separate opinions, 2 of them said what sparing the emperor had cost the trial. Webb, who throughout the trial had reminded the court that it was not trying Hirohito, attacked the total immunity Hirohito had been given and rejected the claim that a ruler could start a war and then say he had no choice. Henri Bernard of France went further, writing that the war's principal author had escaped prosecution altogether and the men just convicted were merely his accomplices. But Hirohito's power was exactly why he was spared. The same authority that should have put his conduct before the court made him indispensable to the Americans now occupying Japan. From the start, MacArthur had ruled through the emperor because a cooperative Hirohito meant a country that would obey and there would be a peaceful occupation. So the very power Hirohito had shown in ending the war was what made him too valuable to prosecute. And the Cold War sealed it. By 1948, with communism spreading across Asia, Washington wanted Japan rebuilt as an ally against the Soviet Union, rather than punished, making any return to the emperor's guilt less likely still. The 7 men sentenced to death at the Tokyo trial were hanged in December 1948, but Hirohito reigned on for another 40 years after this, and in all that time he never publicly accepted responsibility for his part in the war. He had visited Yasukuni 8 times after the war, Japan's shrine to its war dead, with his last visit coming in 1975. But in 1978, the war criminals of the Tokyo trial, with Tojo among them, were quietly enshrined there after their deaths, and Hirohito never went back. He never said why either, but the record of his reason survived in an imperial household official's private papers. His objection was due to those men being honored. There was not a word said about his own part in the war they had fought. He reigned until his death on January 7th, 1989, having never once answered for the war fought in his name. Justice never reached Hirohito, but did it ever reach Shiro Ishii, the man who ran Japan's biological warfare program? Click the video on screen now to find out.